Hello everybody, many thanks for coming. My name's Professor Jane Raisborough and I'm a body double for Professor Susan Watkins, who is the Director of the Culture and Arts at Leeds Beckett University. On her behalf, I really want to welcome you all to this Leeds Cultural Conversation. It's organised in partnership with Leeds City Council and also the publisher Palgrave Macmillan. We are working very hard and closely with Palgrave on their campaign for the humanities. And we're very keen on getting our research out to you, the public, and hearing about what you think. Now today, I'm delighted to introduce Professor Andrew Cooper. He is the Dean of the School of Cultural Studies and Humanities at Leeds Beckett University. Andrew's teaching and research interests are in the politics of language theory and social and cultural discourses. His research argues that there is important work to conceptualise language, that this can be found in poetry and novels of the 19th century, as well as in Victorian philological writings. Recently, he's been working on the relationship between language and the digital realm, from early dependency on machine codes to the advent of programming language. All of this accumulates in the current explosion of interest in digital communications facilitated by the Internet of Things. It's all going to sound very interesting, isn't it? So his talk today is titled, Look Who's Talking, Language and Literature in the World of Data. Andrew.
Thank you, Jan. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for those kind words. Thank you, everyone, for coming. This is a snapshot of some of the research I've been doing that James just alluded to. Let me begin with a question. How much language have you used or generated today? Perhaps an odd question. Compare it with how much data have you used or generated today? It's the kind of question that we might ask ourselves, or others might ask of us, in a world of data. Today I'm going to think about the way in which data is produced, the way it's harvested, the way it's reproduced, as though it were a form of language. Language from us, human beings, and our use of data to communicate with the world around us, and increasingly language from objects, from things, via the Internet of Things and the data our devices produce about us. My premise is that increasingly data is used in a particular way. It's conceptualized as language. That'll come back in a bit. Oh, it might be. There we are. It's coming back on the screen. Is it going to come back up there? Okay, back. I think we're there. Yep, right. I shall keep my feet still, which is very difficult. They're rather large as well. Okay, so my premise is that increasingly data is conceptualized as a language from things, including human beings. A language to be controlled, to be manipulated, and we in some ways are both the objects and the agents of that language. Just for note, in keeping with current trends, I'm going to refer to data in the singular, so data is rather than data are. But I want to examine this in more detail. I'm going to look at literature. Perhaps unsurprisingly, this will include references to steampunk literature. I'm going to consider, perhaps surprisingly, research into the history of ideas about language, about how language is conceptualized and how it's defined. And I'm going to suggest, perhaps bizarrely, that this enables us usefully to reframe our understanding of a digital realm in which data from things, including human beings, is increasingly thought of as a form of language that impacts on us in the virtual and the real world. So, the issue. An exponential growth in connected devices. It's the so-called fourth industrial revolution. The Internet of Things is very much the phase that we're in at the moment. Things that produce data all the time and in real time as well. Not just the data that we produce, messages that we text, photos that we upload or videos, but also data from GPS, from our website searches, data about us and our activity online. I think the real issue here is how data, once produced from these things, is then harvested, reproduced, and used in economic systems that increasingly depend upon the ceaseless production of data. This leads to some very big questions. The power of Facebook and Google, for example, the political power of an organisation like Cambridge Analytica, echo chambers and fake news, artificial intelligence, possible loss of control of jobs and the future itself. And then into work around face and voice recognition, some really interesting and slightly disconcerting work being done by MIT in the States that is leading into private company spin-outs. Technology issues, and then a revisiting of that interface between what's the private world and what's the public world. So some really big questions, some really big issues, and I'm not going to pretend to answer all of those. I'm just putting those out there as a way of orientating what I am going to talk about. But what I'm going to talk about operates on a national and an international scale. It's global. The Internet of Things is growing all the time. The European Commission confidently predicts that there will be 6 billion Internet of Things connections within the EU by 2020. The US Department of Commerce says that the number of connected devices in the United States will double more or less from 2.3 billion to 4.1 billion, and that globally connected devices will increase from 16 billion to 26 billion over the same period. I think the only thing you can say about those figures is they're wrong. They underestimate the growth. So it's global, but it's also very local. Those of us who are familiar with this city know that Leeds is Data City. That isn't Leeds, but it's trying to convey an idea that I want to talk about. We have the Leeds Data Mill, we have the Leeds Institute for Data and Analytics, we have the Open Data Institute, we have the economics of this city based upon health tech, fintech, gaming, betting, bet tech. But Leeds is also very distinctive because it has its independent internet exchange. And that's still very important, although it goes back some time. It meant that the internet exchange in Leeds was completely independent, an entirely separate entity. And it meant that it could grow into a not-for-profit internet exchange. It was established in 2008, as I'm sure many of you know, and launched in 2010. And it was part of an initiative to promote collaboration between internet operators in Yorkshire. The really important thing is that the Leeds Internet Exchange helped members to grow their network flexibility without the data traffic having to go to London. And that's a game changer. In 2008, all networks were interconnected into the capital and the two internet exchanges that were based there. Leeds was very different at that point, and it's something that has made it very different as we go along. So Leeds, yes, digital data capital of the UK, but distinguished by an open data approach. Leeds is part of a global network of open data institutes. The global network founded by Tim Berners-Lee, who you may have heard of, and also Sir Nigel Shadbolt back in 2012. The ODI in Leeds started 1 year later, 2013. Again, an independent, not-for-profit organisation. It's funded by sponsors from local authorities, governments, commercial entities, universities, all of whom believe in the power of open data to drive social, economic and cultural change. And that makes Leeds very distinctive. So it's global, it's local, and of course it's also very personal. You might recognise this picture here. This is from the recent running of the Experian ad, which asks you about your data self. Has relaunched the career of Marcus Brigstock, I would say. Who or what is your data self? What is its story? How is that told? What is its agency? What is its power? I think the one thing you can say is that it can certainly lead to some very intimate self-confrontations. This sense of another self out there. Recently, the British Academy and the Royal Society came together, the Royal Society of Science came together, and they jointly, which is quite rare, jointly expressed the need for fresh perspectives on all of this. Today I want to talk about how literature and the history of language theory can potentially provide some of those new perspectives. My hypothesis is that when confronting or even challenging the issues raised by the Fourth Industrial Revolution in respect of the harvesting of data from the Internet of Things, it is useful to reframe the key issue in order to focus upon the production and reproduction of data as a form of language. Moreover, I think if we do this, we can reset our critical understanding of many aspects of this Fourth Industrial Revolution. English, history, media are very important. They always have been, but they're increasingly so. This is not just a tech issue, as many of us know. So, I want to start with the idea that language comes from things. Look at how this is phrased in relation to the Internet of Things. Things, objects, talk to one another through being connected. There's a crucial flip that comes through this. Via the data being produced as we use social media, sending texts and photos and videos and what have you, this then switches to data writing our communications. We're all familiar with predictive text and where that can lead us. It assumes to know what we want to say. And then you've got data writing your interests. So you're increasingly served stories by Facebook, or you are shown job opportunities that purport to match to your interests. And this comes from the data we generate when posting and searching. And that's where the full flip occurs. That data, which comes from things, including us, but objects that we use every day, begins to write our identity and begins to write our story as well. We move from predictive text to predictive narrative, or from data as a form of language from things talking to one another, things that include us. But there's nothing new under the sun. Things that speak. It's an idea that we're all familiar with, actually. Things in this image speak of the identity of Leeds. The things in this image speak of someone's perhaps unhealthy fascination with the Flintstones. This is a house in Hillsborough in Northern California, and you can see what its owner is trying to do. The things in this image speak of someone's fascination with steampunk. This is taken from the Steampunk Festival in Shrewsbury last year, and it's typical of the participants and the way in which they demonstrate through the things that they are wearing their interest in steampunk. Steampunk is what it says through the aesthetic. It's a retro-futuristic understanding and also a retro-futuristic practice in relation to tech and the DIY punk element of reinventing tech. It's a lived experience of technology that looks back as well as forward. And it's an aesthetic that also has a form of writing. Steampunk literature. It's a genre, sometimes known as neo-Victorian literature, although that's a broader concept in many ways. It has a characteristic trait. What it does is to project some of our contemporary technological fascinations, anxieties and desires onto a 19th century where tech imaginatively exists, but is invariably driven by clockwork engines and steam power. It's very often subversive. That's the punk element that goes with steam. It's, if you like, a reimagining of the 19th century's interest in society and culture, raising some of the issues of that time and putting them in a new light, but also necessarily reflecting upon our own moment with technology all around us. So it's retrofuturistic, it offers a challenge, and it definitely engages with politics. Excuse me. And you can see this right in the first instance that many people think of steampunk fiction, The Difference Engine, by William Gibson and Bruce Sterling, which I had to remind myself was first published in 1990. It's quite a long time ago. It has overt references to prototypes of computing machine that very much relate to the historical evidence we have of the work of Charles Babbage with the difference engine and the analytical engine. It's a retrofuturistic world, as I've said, so this would not be PowerPoint, this would be keynotrope work that I'd be doing at the moment. It looks at technology in terms of surveillance, and it is full of political intrigue. It's also very disruptive. It retells the history of 19th century England, and to a certain extent the history of 19th century America as well. So all of those things are there. But what about the actual history, if you like, of things that speak? They give you something to think about, some daffodils, why not? I'd like to give you a few literary examples of things that speak. This is an extract from a poem by Felicia Hemans called The Image in the Lava, which was published in 1827. And it's based upon the impression of a woman's form clasping an infant child to her chest, which was found at the uncovering of Herculaneum, which is not easy to say. This is from near the opening. Thou thing of years departed, what ages have gone by, since here the mournful seal was set by love and agony. The human literally becomes a thing, but by being a thing, it speaks more loudly of some of the issues that Felicia Hemans wants to explore. This is the 9th stanza. Oh, I could pass all relics left by the pomps of old, to gaze on this rude monument cast in affection's mould. The thing which is, on the face of it, inferior to human identity, actually becomes a monument that speaks of key aspects of human identity and gender issues as well. And we are used to things, we're used to the land, the very earth that we speak on, talking to us. It's an image of pastoral, if you like. The land can speak of pastoral communities. And, you know, we all know how far writers can take that. These texts that I'm referring to are not neo-Victorian. They belong to the so-called long 19th century, from the end of the 18th century into the 19th century. And the land can speak in surprising ways during that period, because we also have John Clare's poetry in this period, a landscape that literally speaks. This is an extract from his poem, The Lament of Swordywell, or Swaddywell. He wrote it sometime between 1821 and 1824 because of the censorship on the political messages of his poetry. It wasn't published until 1835. And this is just a brief extract. There was a time my bit of ground made freeman of the slave. The ass no pinder dared to pound when I his supper gave. The gypsy's camp was not afraid, I made his dwelling free, till vile enclosure came and made a parish slave of me. A little bit of dialect thrown in there. Pindard was someone who used to round up stray livestock. What the land is talking about, this is the actual land itself, not a persona. What the land is talking about is the political, economic and social impact of enclosure, when large landholders basically claimed common land for themselves. In John Clare's poetry, the land literally speaks for itself. It speaks out against the injustices of enclosure by the rich and powerful. It does so in a way which includes the dialect of local populations, but it speaks in ways that people from that area could not do, because they would have been prosecuted in many ways for doing this. And that's why Clare's poetry didn't see the light of day for quite a few years. And then we might want to consider this. This is by Coleridge. It's from a poem called The Destiny of Nations, a Vision. I chose it partly because it sums up what I want to say, but also it nicely spans the 18th and the 19th century. It was begun in 1797 and then abandoned and eventually published in 1817. And it contains these lines. For all that meets the bodily sense I deem symbolical, one mighty alphabet for infant minds. Things in the world are, they're not like, they are an alphabet of language for Coleridge. Things in the world speak to him, including daffodils for his fellow poet, Wordsworth. Those crazy romantics, eh? All things speaking to them, usually in ways which we struggle to understand. But if we look at some of the writings on language of the period, I don't think it's surprising that we actually see language being thought of, being conceptualised in very similar ways as we move from the 1700s into the 1800s. If you haven't met him before, meet John Horne-Tooke. John Horne-Tooke wrote a book called The Diversions of Purley. It was published in 2 volumes, 1786 and 1805. And in that book, John Horne-Tooke set out an alternative understanding of language to that which was proposed and reinforced by the authorities of the day, including someone who used to be the Chancellor of the Exchequer, James Harris. That version of language, the official version of language, said that we must all speak the same language and we must all use the same grammar. John Horne-Tooke, who aspired to be a radical politician and came very close to taking up a seat in the Houses of Parliament, to the point where he actually won one election and then was disbarred afterwards, wasn't allowed to take up his seat. He wanted to contest that. And he did so by re-theorising language. And he basically said, forget all this fancy stuff, all these grammars and authorities that come out. Language is very easy to understand. There are 2 types of words in language. There are necessary words, and then there are all the other words which are abbreviations of the necessary words. Very straightforward theory. The necessary words are nouns, primarily, and some verbs. And those necessary words literally come from your experience of the objects you encounter in the material world. Literally come from the objects that you encounter. Language comes from things, which leads to some fairly crazy etymologies, some of which are just frankly very bizarre, including this one. This is John Horne-Tooke's attempt to define the verb to think. Remember, where we now say I think, the ancient expression was me thinketh. That is, me thingeth. It thingeth me. Our thoughts, our language, they come from objects, from things. Eventually it even drove him mad. He tried to write a 3rd volume and in the end threw it on the fire, which is very disappointing because I've tried to find if there are any remnants of that 3rd volume and there simply aren't. He just burnt the whole lot. He couldn't make it work. But there's a very serious side to this. It was perceived as an incredibly powerful challenge to ideas about language. The notion that things could produce words rather than authorities telling you what words mean was really way beyond controversial. So, for instance, we can consider the way in which Horne-Tooke redefines the noun rights, saying that it comes from our material understanding of the world around us, not from what people tell us it means. It's derived from our experience. We can all understand rights because we can all have experiences of the things that lead to language. And therefore, the concept that goes with the word rights is not controlled by authorities. Might not surprise you, other than the dates, this is the end of the 18th century into the 19th, John Horne-Tooke was put in the Tower. It sounds incredibly old-fashioned to me, but he was actually put in the Tower on the charge of treason. Well, eventually, John Horne-Tooke and the Diversions of Purley were dismissed. People kind of clued up to the idea that the etymologies of words were a bit mad. For a while they lived with that, and then eventually, of course, it just drifted away. But it's really important to look at. Firstly, because it was a very powerful reconceptualization of language. It allowed a lot of others to produce radical alternative voices. And there's a whole history of those writing on language, but it also includes people like Tom Paine and Cobbett, who wrote in a way which fed from this notion of words coming from things and not being controlled by others. It was also a theory of language that persisted well beyond Horne-Tooke's lifetime, and some would say deep into the mid-19th century. For some, it had to be overcome for the true understanding of language to emerge. And that true understanding is epitomised by the new, later Oxford English Dictionary, which many who have looked at the history of language theory say, well, that's when the 19th century actually moved to a science of language, understood what it was about, and produced a proper dictionary with proper ways of thinking about language. And that meant, of course, getting rid of Horne-Tooke. Others, myself included, argue that actually the theory of language that sits behind that dictionary didn't simply overcome the radical ideas that Horne-Tooke put forward, as well as others. It actually had to incorporate those ideas into its thinking of language in order to nullify them. So in some way, the idea that words come from things is brought into the understanding of language that led to that dictionary. I'll just give you an image, if we can get the clicker to work, there we are, of the first editor of the Oxford English Dictionary as we now know it, James Murray. What am I saying here? Well, through the second half of the 19th century, words became things. They became objects of scientific study. And these objects or things were also used to speak another story. They were used as things to speak the story of the national English language. And some have argued that that whole movement in many ways was part of a response to social, political movements like Chartism. That can be explored another day. I want to explore some other conclusions at the moment. When we talk about words as things in this way, not the mad Horne-Tooke way, but this way, that they're objects, they're things, then you can control, or come very close to controlling, the understanding of language that people have. Words are literally put into boxes. This is James Murray in the scriptorium, which is the engine room of the dictionary. He had readers all over the country looking into text and sending him quotes to demonstrate the meaning of the words that he was working on. And they all ended up in these little pigeonholes. He even got his kids doing it. There's some great stories about fascination with the word toe rag and where that would fit in. The kids seem to find that one particularly interesting. There they are in the scriptorium. Literary language is being catalogued. It's being stored. This, if you like, is the early version of the text that comes out afterwards. Literary language with quotes from literary sources to back up the meanings of words, that's what becomes the material of the dictionary. And that is what becomes, for many people at the time, the material of the standard national language as well. It's almost a fixed language, almost. It's made out of word objects, quotes produced by others. So, when I asked you how much language have you generated today, in some ways that perpetuates the idea that all of us produce the word objects that constitute the English language. But that's quite controversial. If you look at some of the authors who are cited in the dictionary, they might not think of themselves as English. There are plenty of authors in there who would contest that. But I think it exemplifies how the language you produce can be used to reinforce a thing-like definition of language that then exists beyond you and possibly writes your identity, or maybe rewrites it. Now, to a certain extent, this is a historical study that I've set out. front of you. You know, we're going right back to the 1700s to think about the Internet of Things. History's got to be in there somewhere, I should think. But it's not a closed history. What I'm saying is there are reinterpretations and different versions of what has happened in the past. So if you just think about Horne Tooke, a writer right in the early 1800s, Dugald Stewart, was very opposed to Horne Tooke. He was one of the early ones to say, no, really not, this just does not work. But he didn't disagree with the idea that words came from things. He just thought that we shouldn't worry about the things. The most important part was the proliferation of meanings, which then became a kind of sea, if not an ocean, of metaphors. And don't think about things. In other words, lose the original meaning and don't worry about it. Which opens the door for someone to tell you what the actual meaning is out of their preferred metaphor. Then there's another writer, Jeremy Bentham, and he was involved, of course, with the utilitarians, who prolonged the life of Horne Tooke's ideas. So not surprisingly, he was in favour of John Horne Tooke, liked the idea that words came from things, very much along the lines of Dugald Stewart, said, yeah, that produces different meanings. But he called those different meanings fictions. And for Bentham, the history of those fictions, how those fictions of meaning are made, that's the key to understanding power within society. Well, I would maintain that some of this demonstrates the importance of studying English, history, and media. All three of those discipline areas actually deliver into what the World Economic Forum has as its top 10 skills for 2020. Skills that are needed globally for jobs that don't yet exist, but will come as a result of the fourth industrial revolution. But I think we can go further than that. We can do more with the expertise that we have in these areas and the research we undertake, which opens up historical issues in new ways, and in ways that can demonstrate their relevance to today. So, for example, I'd like to move on now to focus on the notion of standard language. Standard language as made from and out of things. Through the reaction to Horne Tooke, words became objects, produced by thing-like people because those people had very little control over their language. They were told what their, quote, mother tongue was. Those word objects are not then simply collected in Murray's scriptorium to constitute the English language, the standard language. They are also collectively, as objects, made to speak the identity of the English standard language. That is to say, those words are portrayed as speaking the identity and the story, predictive text and narrative not far away, of those obliged to use these word things when they speak and when they write. On that basis, let's move to look at the Internet of Things, taking the example of how the key issue of standardization is shaping how things, including human beings, speak, and what the language of data can say, in general, as a form of communication, and also as a language that continuously speaks about its users. All of these things are linked. They are linked to things. Couldn't resist putting this one up. It doesn't work quite so well since, not surprisingly, the event didn't actually happen, but knowing when I was going to give this talk, I had to get this in somewhere. The current challenge with the Internet of Things, in many ways, is about whether to impose regulation or give rein to free market forces. And that's because a lot of attention is focused upon the need for establishing open data standards. Open data standards are essential if we are to facilitate the interoperability between devices and the real-time analysis of the data that they produce. In Europe, try again, there we go. the EU states that there's a need to accelerate the development of common standards and interoperable solutions. Interoperability is essential for the deployment of the Internet of Things and the seamless flow of data across sectors and regions. And for the EU, it's very much about, surprise, surprise, regulation. That's the way that most of the documents that talk about standardization and the Internet of Things describe what is required. If you go over to the States and you look at some of the writings of the Department of Commerce, then it's a little bit different. By contrast, it is the department's position that a private sector-led approach to standards development with appropriate government participation is fundamental to successfully developing these standards. Put very bluntly, in the US, the view is governments should not take the lead or direct development of standards. It's about the market. It's about the private sector. And what about us in the UK? Well, we don't know which way we're going, but we don't know which way we're going on this either. It might all depend on how we understand some of the key issues of standardization in relation to the Internet of Things and the language of data that is produced. And I think for a new perspective, not a techie one, but a new perspective, which takes up some of the retro-futuristic ways of looking of steampunk, we can turn to a historical study of the conceptualization of language, albeit a conceptualization or an idea of language in a pre-tech era of literature and standard national language. And we can do so in terms of generating a new perspective on how we're thinking about language today, data as language. Let's just consider a couple of key issues. This is a number of extracts from a book by Philip Howard called Pax Technica. I think it sets us thinking about some of the implications of what I'm saying, and also resonates with some of what Horn Tuck was doing back at the end of the 18th century, the beginning of the 19th century. I think Philip Howard quite rightly says that many civil society groups these days, even those who aren't particularly concerned with technology policy issues, now think of internet freedoms as human rights. We have a right of access to the internet and a right to use it in certain ways. Why does he say this? Well, he points out that very often when governance breaks down via government, people use their devices. So if you're living in a part of the world and you're not getting services, you're not getting clean water, for example, because the government, the state, has failed, there's every likelihood that you will use your mobile phone and other devices to connect with people who can supply the deficit, who can give you the water that you need. So the Internet of Things, those smart devices, actually, in many ways, pushes government to the back and takes over the role of governance. But it brings implications. In a world in which most of our political, economic and cultural lives are mediated by network devices, such as the one I'm using here to talk to you from, the power lies in setting the technical standards. We're back to standardization. And for Howard, the most important clash will be between people and devices that push for open and interoperable networks and those who work for closed networks. So, a preliminary conclusion about what English, history and media can offer in such a world. What I've set out hopefully suggests, and there isn't time to do more than that today, but I hope it suggests that despite current trends and drives, with governments and private sector very often indistinguishable, you can't tell the difference between them sometimes, data is most definitely not a homogeneous language with supra-meaning that is constantly and irrevocably reinforced by our use and production of data, as though we were things in this vast network of connected things across the world. It's not that. I think we can go further. Writing right at the beginning of the 20th century, Valentin Voloshinov looked back at the study of language, and he said that the 19th century had very much focused upon producing dictionary words, which he called dead alien language. That was his immediate perspective on what had happened during the course of the long 19th century in England and across Europe. I think we can move to a position where we can say that the current conceptualization, the current thinking of data as a form of language in the digital realm reifies data as language. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, it makes not only language from things, but it also creates a thing-like form of language, a dead language. It makes us into thing-like producers of dead data language. That's the risk that we're running at the moment. And frankly, it's sometimes in the interests of governments and private sector to do so. That impinges on some of those really big questions I raised at the beginning and have kept well away from throughout the course of this talk. If data is a dead language in the way I've just described, once produced, then you can easily reproduce and manipulate it. It won't fight back. It's dead. Moreover, if its speakers are thing-like, if they become objects which simply generate this language and use it, they produce so much data, then you can also treat those thing-like producers of language with as little as concern as you would everyday objects. But I hope I've also shown today that we don't have to go along with that conceptualization of data as a form of language from things. There are alternatives. Horn took some of the literary writers I've mentioned, some of the language theorists I've mentioned, like Bentham. They all engaged with the concept of language from things. They got to grips with it. They produced alternative understandings. Ooh. It's going to come back in a minute, I think. There we are. They produced alternative understandings of what language could do. And they also spoke through a language of things in ways that constantly challenged attempts to make it into a dead language. They used the very idea of language to fight back, proving that it could not be easily manipulated. In effect, many of those writers that I'm interested in really contested the idea that speakers of such a language could be treated merely as objects. And I think that's what we can take via English, history and media as disciplines of study into our understandings of data as a form of language in the digital realm today. And we can see it in Leeds. Just go back to that idea of Leeds as data city. Data as a form of language which is crucial to the key public and private sector initiatives within this city and to the region's economy. But also in Leeds, you have this emphasis upon open access to data. You have constant event hackathons where large data sets are reinterpreted, manipulated in ways which perhaps will be very surprising to those who usually receive the data and crunch it as though there's only one answer to come from it. There's a reinterpretation of data through these initiatives. It's not left to be controlled by others. There are things producing language, yes, there are all over the world. But there are also people taking that data language from things and using it in really disruptive ways. And you end up with a multiplicity of different voices, like you do in the 19th century when you look closely. The data from things, including us as human beings, rather than being a dead language simply to be decoded and manipulated, is open to different ways of speaking about the things and the human beings who produce the data. So, final conclusion to finish. Looking at Joe. Maybe, just maybe, the answer is one that's quite popular at the moment, which is to say that we should look for the private ownership of data. We should in effect set up private data repositories and not rely on companies to hold the data for us. Even without those companies holding our data language. I think this is highly unlikely. I don't think some of those companies, Google, Facebook, are going to be happy simply to become an interface. But also, we wouldn't be able to set up those repositories without those companies. The technology is embedded within them. Moreover, and I think this is the really telling argument against that notion of private data repositories, if we're thinking about data as language, and I hope you are now, because otherwise it's been a long talk for no purpose. If we're thinking about data as language, then surely we have to remember that language is living. It's not dead, unless you choose to make it so. It's living because we share words. We constantly re-accentuate, re-emphasize words, and re-inflect them. And that comes through our shared communitarian use of those words. Very much the context for what I'm talking about in the 19th century. So, therefore, my very final conclusion is slightly different. This is something I saw in Headingley a few weeks ago. I didn't write that. I nearly got run over photographing it because I got a bit too far away and was standing in the middle of the road. But I was just fascinated by it. Become the data. What's it doing there? Anyway, I hope I've shown how literature and language can reframe the question of how we become the data. I hope I've done that today, or at least got you thinking about it. How we become the data we produce. Just like speaking and reproducing language that apparently defines us, English, we produce data that does speak our identity and our story, apparently. But just like our use of English language, access to data brings a certain unpredictability into all of this. Just in the way that our use of English language is unpredictable and disruptive through the discourses that we use every day, so we can see that open access to data allows us to get the feel of a form of language that can enable us to speak of our own identities, our own worlds, in multiple ways, that disrupt rather than confirm the language of data that people would push towards us. So, in terms of that image and data as language, ask yourself the question there. Do you see the thing like wall, or do you see the voice of intent and disruption? Or do you see both? That's a big question to finish on, but I hope English, history and media can help you to see the answer in different ways. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Very interesting talk. Any questions from the floor, please? This is that moment where everyone goes a little bit shy.
Yeah, I haven't formulated this question properly yet.
Okay.
But one of the kind of things, because of the use of the word data repeatedly through the process, there are a couple of things that came to mind that I can't quite make questions, but are kind of comments, I suppose.
Sure.
The first is an etymological one. The data is that which is given. So, literally from the Latin saying you've got to, it's the pre-existing form. And that relates in some ways to those ideas about language being a pre-existing form that in some senses speaks us.
Mm-hmm.
So there are always limits to the unpredictability. Or aren't there? Do you see what I'm getting at?
I do. As you were phrasing that, I was thinking of Shelley, actually. Again, a writer from this period that I'm interested in, who in Prometheus Unbound actually has it both ways, and I think that would be partly my answer. At one point he talks about language as being preformed and articulating, speaking who we are as individuals. And in another part of that poem he actually says, no, it's the world that produces language, and only then does it define who we are. And I think it oscillates between the two. So yeah, data is our given, and we give freely the data that I'm producing through this tablet now, the laptop's producing, the phone in my pocket. We give it freely. But actually, is it ours once given? And I think what you find is a movement backwards and forwards across that notion of language as predefined and languages coming from our interaction with the world.
So,
Yeah.
so the sort of follow-on question, which I suppose is really about the languages that pre-exist and the expertise you have to have in order to operate within them. So we're a language community, and I assume that everybody more or less understands what I'm saying because I'm using words that everybody knows in a grammatical structure that is understood. They all kind of know what I mean. But in that world, how many of us have the expertise to speak?
I would say all of us, which might surprise you.
It surprises me.
One of the reasons I say that is because of something I couldn't quite cram into this paper, because Jane would take me off at the kneecaps and try to make it any longer. I got really interested in the idea, and you can see Brexit in the background, of frictionless interactions. Frictionless border, that's a big issue, of course, with Brexit. Well, it isn't, it's a sideshow, but becomes the big issue. I think the way I would answer that point is to say, we reach into our pockets or wherever, we have this. I have no idea of the technology that drives that. In the same way, I have really no idea how these magical leads that I keep treading on manage to produce that and then don't produce it. It changes, it disappears. No idea. And frankly, a limited interest in knowing. But my interactions through this device are frictionless. I can produce text, I can produce video, I can make purchases. If I had to actually produce code to download video every time I wanted to see it, or use code to upload it for others to see, that would be an entirely different issue. But this gives you the impression of being able to do all of the things with data as language that you talk about in terms of English language, grammar, etc. So in some ways it's an impression, but I think it's a very important one, because if we were forced all the time to go through some of the technological requirements to have access to the information we consume and distribute, then it would feel very different. But the reality is, all of that data is actually being funneled by the technology we don't understand. It's not a big conspiracy plot that I'm interested in. It's just one of the constraints that operates upon the data we use as though it were a free form of language.
Yeah, I've got some comments as well, observations. I was really interested in John Hontuck's idea of language and maybe how it links to a much older kind of set of histories. And there I'm thinking of the work of Walter Ong on language and also David Abraham, who talks about indigenous cultures who think that the land speaks to them,
Yes.
or the wind speaks,
Yeah.
or the breath, and how the sounds of nature and the sounds of the human voice became standardized into the Hebrew, first the alphabet, and then the Greek alphabet. So there was already that kind of standardization before we even reached the technological standardization that we're talking about.
Yeah. I think that's fascinating,
It's a
Mel.
long history.
I was going to use a quote from the Aeolian Harp by Coleridge, which is the wind speaking to us through a lute which is simply placed in a tree. Nobody else is playing it, it's just the wind blowing through, producing these sounds, these notes. Hontuck's very interested in native speakers, and of course a lot of romantic poetry talks about an indigenous population that is in some way in tune with a form of language that city dwellers find hard to access. I think what drives all of that for me is partly the idea of digital natives, a concept which people don't use now quite rightly, but there was a sense in which initially everyone started thinking of those who were in tune with this way of using data and those who weren't. But they talked about it as being digital rather than data-driven at the time. And I think data makes a big shift. If you start thinking about it in terms of data rather than digital technology, I think you begin to get a very different perspective on it. but it's not too far removed from some of those writers that you've mentioned, definitely.
Anybody else? Okay, I'm going to take chair's privilege then, unless I can stir anybody into asking a question. I thought you made a really compelling case for what English history and media can add to the digital realm. I just wondered so we know what we can do for them. What can they do for us? What can the digital realm bring to the humanity?
Well, I think working in a city like Leeds actually puts our own labour, our own work in a different light. So when I talk about neo-Victorian literature, when I talk about romantic poets, when I talk about theories of language from over 100 years ago, I'm very aware that in this city, the ideas that I'm exploring have a resonance which is very much of the contemporary of this time. And it's not simply looking back and describing something that is in some way cut off by the period of time. It's actually looking back and making that work that we do relevant to today. And I think a city like Leeds helps us in that hugely, enormously. My work has changed beyond recognition in the last 5 years or so. And a lot of that is down to Leeds being the kind of city it is. Because I start looking at the research I do and thinking of its contemporary relevance beyond academia.
Thank you very much. Last chance for questions. She's got time for one.
I do have a question.
Oh, thanks.
It's sort of massive, and I don't know if it's like appropriate,
And
it's also not formed yet, so
Okay,
right, I'll
bring
give
that
it a
down.
go. I was
Time.
I was thinking about disruption and disruptiveness, and
Yes.
I mean, it seems that you're onto something really compelling there, and that two major historic shifts in the 21st century could be seen as data disruptions, right, in the form of Brexit, maybe one of them the
Yeah.
Arab Spring as well.
Yes,
I
very
don't
much
know,
so,
they kind
yeah.
of linked to one another too. And so then I'm kind of thinking back, and so then you kind of also, if we're thinking about this in historic terms, that Chartism might also be seen as in some way linked to that, and helping us to resist all of that at the same time. I think, no, it's about hunger, and it's about anger, and pointing with the stick and so on.
Yeah, I mean, if you're talking about things in the material world, then it definitely is about those material forms of oppression that force you to act and to challenge. But I think for me, working on some of the political and social movements of this long 19th century, I can develop a different lens for looking at what's happening today. That's not to say that there's an equivalence. I wouldn't equate the Arab Spring with the mass social movement of Chartism. But when I look at some of the ways in which informal or unofficial forms of communication were devised, when I think back to how people took what was already in circulation and made it their own. So going back a little earlier, right to the beginning of the 19th century, Thomas Spence, fantastic radical writer, would take coin of the realm, the large coins that you would have. He would take a penny, for instance, and he would stamp a political slogan on it and then put it back into distribution. And every now and then someone would look at and what you've done is disrupt or subvert a form of currency but also communication that everybody takes for granted. And I think it's not a case of equivalent or even parallels, but I think if you start looking at what's happening today through that prism, through that lens, you start seeing some different things going on. And again, I think Leeds is really interesting for that. If you think of some of the social movements that are operating through the open access to data, and how, in many ways, they're obliged to flirt with the devil. They have to use the very devices that could potentially close down those ideas in order to communicate with one another.
Phone's the largest Chartist newspaper as well.
Exactly, yeah. That's the closest I can get to answering the question.
Yeah.
It's still work I'm exploring. Yeah.
Brilliant questions, Michael. Thank you. So, no other questions? I'd just like to thank Andrew again for a stimulating talk.
Thank you, everybody, for coming today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.